all, I'd like to first and foremost like to say a huge thank you to you, Benjamin, founder of Israel Plan Organization, for inviting me to participate in the 2021 Solomon Forum, and more particularly to discuss this timely topic, combating anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. My name is Ugoji Eze, attorney by profession, international lawyer, part of civil society at the United Nations in New York. I focus primarily on anti-Semitism. In 2014, I hosted an event, Anti-Semitism, a Threat to International Peace and Security, in which I spoke of the emergence of anti-Semitism, more particularly in Europe. And I did say that anti-Semitism and anti-Semitic incidents will come to the United States. And I'm sorry to say that my prediction proved to be correct. There is a need to outsmart anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism is an ancient hatred that has taken diverse kinds from time immemorial. It is back in the open globally. As hatred and indeed distrust of the Jews around the world, it begs the question of what causes it and how best to respond to it. It is indeed on the rise on all fronts, namely new anti-Semitism on the left, classic anti-Semitism on the right, and anti-Semitism of Islamic extremists. On the one hand, while we speak about anti-Semitism, we must also speak about the rise of anti-Zionists. The recent shootings on the 16th of March, 2021, at the 3 Atlanta spas resulted in the death of 6 people, of whom were women of Asian descent. This tragic and horrific loss of life occurred amid a recent wave of attacks against Asian Americans. There's a long history of racist rhetoric, physical and psychological attacks against Asian Americans. Since the commencement of the COVID-19 global pandemic, there has been over 3,000 hate crimes and incidents against Asian Americans. If I may quote from the late Dr. Reverend Martin Luther King, I quote, "Returning hate for hate multiplies hate, adding to deeper darkness, to a night already devoid of stars. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, only love can do that. Hate multiplies hate, violence multiplies violence, and toughness multiplies toughness in a descending spiral of destruction." End of quote. Violence against Asian American women sadly echoes numerous horrific experiences of African Americans, Native Americans, Latino Americans, and other minority women and other marginalized communities. The systematic sexism that haunts Asian American women also haunts Black women and other women of color. Any hate crimes against all women must be condemned, and the perpetrators must be brought to justice. My organization, Renew Our Earth, stands firmly in solidarity with the Asian American community, just as we are in solidarity with the Jewish community, the Muslim community, and the Black community, and any other community that is a victim of systemic racism, sexism, and any other system of inequality. There is a need for collaboration between the Asian American, Jewish, and African American communities. Silence is complicity. We need to speak out, unite, and walk hand in hand with our sisters in all communities. As the late Dr. Martin Luther King said, I quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. End of quote. As regards anti-Semitism, the bleeding question, or the begging question is, how can we deal with the ongoing onslaught of anti-Semitism? I believe, for one, there's a need to reduce the stress associated with it. We need to be optimistic, namely surviving and thriving. We must not above all lose the sight that we live in an era where the majority of Jews do not live under regimes that persecute. Bishcom, the ultimate answer is anxiety. Namely, we need to adopt a trusting attitude, knowing that God is indeed going to remove all and will be an everlasting presence in our midst. The Torah teaches that the success of any of our endeavors is God's providence and indeed blessings. We need to counter anti-Semitism with positivity, purpose, and indeed pride. As King Solomon had said in Proverbs chapter 12, verse 25, I quote, "If there is anxiety in your heart, quash it." But the working definition of anti-Semitism as espoused by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, which is indeed a non-legal binding statement, was adopted in May 2016 by the IHRA plenary in Romania. I quote, "Anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred toward Jews," end of quote. The late Rabbi Lord Jonathan Sacks of blessed memory has described anti-Semitism as a virus. He stated in, I quote, "the future tense, the new anti-Semitism, what is and how do we deal with it?" The Jewish Chronicle of November 2007. He said, "The best way of understanding it is to see it as a virus. How do the viruses survive and flourish? By mutating. Anti-Semitism mutates, and in doing so, defeats the immune system sets up by a culture to protect themselves against hatred," end of quote. The mutation of hate against the Jews historically has been in three stages. Firstly, the classical and the Middle Ages, where religion was used against the Jews, namely Judaism is enemy of the true religion. Then in the 19th century, where science was employed, namely the inferior Jewish race is infecting the Aryan race. And finally, in the 20th century, from the human rights dimension, namely Jews violates human rights. Hatred exists in the mind of the hater, not the hated. There is an inherent need to avoid internalizing anti-Semitism, and above all, believing that by changing one's perception of one's Jewish heritage will solve anti-Semitism. That is not the case. I, for one, believes that one can indeed eradicate, to some extent, anti-Semitism by teaching the world to avoid an inner void and by embracing God's mission for all of humanity. There is a need to be open about one's Jewish identity. That in itself benefits both Jews and indeed other minority. Encountering hate, for example, the American Asian communities. And we must firmly believe that anti-Semitism will indeed be eradicated eventually. It begs the question, how does one countermeasure anti-Semitism? How does one respond to negative rhetoric that undermines Jews and indeed their safety? In short, what strategy would indeed serve as a countermeasure? The French essayist Michel de Montaigu certainly put it where he says, "There is as much difference between us as ourselves as there is between us and others." Possible solutions, which I believe in the way forward in the 21st century of encountering anti-Semitism are, firstly, a public campaign to counter anti-Semitism. Secondly, there's an inherent need to publicly label people as anti-Semitism or enemies, which is indeed counterproductive. Slow to shame and quick to engage is far more productive, and indeed, it should be the order of the day. We need to condition society to bring out the best in people rather than highlight the negative aspects of people. Education, I believe, is a powerful tool, more particularly for the younger generation. We need to bring out self-discipline. We needed to bring out self-discipline, proper character trait, and above all, the awareness that all human beings are indeed created to do good. It is also imperative that Jews live in harmony and promote their interests together. Jewish mysticism espouses that God responds positively to Jewish unity. At the outset of the COVID-19 global pandemic in 2020, in which the virus was predominantly detected in China, it caused a great deal of hatred towards people of Asian descent. There's a need to educate the media to combat negative rhetoric towards the Asian community. In the Western media, there appears to be no distinction between the government of China and the Chinese people, thus resulting in the vilification of the whole nation. Anti-political rhetoric abounded globally, and it needs to be countered. I thank you very much.